if you read the Africa Report 2015, it is very clear that the African energy system is at a crossroads right now. Speaking to Prof. Ian Jard earlier on, he put it very clearly. He says, look, it can either be a challenge or it can be an opportunity.
What started off as these panel discussions has now evolved into what we try to get is the Center for the Management of Energy in Africa. As we all know, energy in Africa is a huge, huge issue. Not a challenge, but an opportunity for us all. And if Africa is to grow the way we think it's going to grow, then we've got to get the energy part right.
Tell you more about the Center for Management of Energy. We went to Professor Habib, the Vice Chancellor, and we shared this vision, and he was excited about it, and he said, look, we're going to work together with Prof. Ian Janrell from the engineering side, and so that we put together this center. And I believe it's going to be a center that will be for Africa as a whole to produce leaders and managers of the energy sector. But in our continent, energy is in crisis, and demand is obviously high, and we need real decisive political leadership to do something about it.
May I start by looking at Southern Africa a little broadly. You cannot talk about an African Renaissance, you cannot talk about Africa rising without energy, without light. This proverbial dark continent has got to be energized, it's got to be illuminated. Energy is not one of the indices, it is in fact a lead index for economic development. Without it, it's a sine qua non. Without it, you cannot talk substantive socioeconomic development. Now, Nigeria is supposed to be the largest economy on the continent, with electricity accessible to just half that population. It would be a mammoth economy. Installed capacity is less than 10,000 megawatts. South Africa, as far back as when I was at ESCOM, was 42,000, and we're barely 50 million. And we're complaining that industrialization is actually hackneyed. It can't really take place. But the lamentable thing about Nigeria is the fact that, in fact, they are flaring up gas. And all you need to do is to harness that and put in a pipe and supply virtually the whole of West Africa. We generate just under 2,000 megawatts. That's Kabarabasa South Bank. All we need to do to have that energy doubled is to develop North Bank. And if you believe Zimbabwe or Zambia can figure it out alone, you actually lie to yourself. It's not figure-outable individually. We have to work together. If we developed Inga 3, we would add about 3,500 megawatts to Southern Africa's requirements. We're battling even to do that. And there are people in Canada, there are people in Norway or the Scandinavian countries who are standing ready to come and help. We can't even say, help us, and this is in fact the regulatory framework, and this is what we would like to do by way of working with you. But then that is only Inga 3. Grand Inga would add to our requirements in Southern Africa 23,000 megawatts of run-of-river energy. In other words, it is actually truly renewable because it disturbs nothing in the river, it disturbs nothing downstream. But because of lack of political will, we trudge along limping as a nation. We remain sub-Saharan Africa as a subcontinent in fragments.
And what we have coming forward now in South Africa is the gas to power program, right? Where over 3 gigawatts have already been designated in the IRP, and I understand another 1.5 gigawatts have been allocated for additional projects in gas to power. What Globeleq is doing there is we secure sites, we develop them, we permit them, and we come up with and we fund the activity. We take the high-risk stage of the project and we push it into the point where we think that we could raise the financing. And we looked to work with global leading companies like Sasol and others to help realize how we can make investments with other companies that, as Dr. Khoza said, mobilize more capital.
2063, the African Union vision for Africa is Africa at peace with itself.
Yeah.
My topic for today is power and utilities from a transformation point of view. So we have distribution, which affects most of us, load shedding or not load shedding. And of course the new part which is coming up now is metering, because that it's using this disruptive technology to make you be part of the energy chain. Globally, this is a big issue. In South Africa, it's becoming a big issue. The rest of Africa, again, because of the challenge we have in Africa, lack of base load. In other words, 2,000 megawatts and above needs a market for it to function properly. Eskom has been buying power from Namibia and pushing it through to Zambia and all that. The challenge then, from an African perspective, is whether ECOWAS and those other trading blocs in West Africa, in East Africa, in Central Africa would do the same. The Southern African power pool, in terms of capacity vis-a-vis demand, as you can see, 2015, 2016, the demand exceeds the capacity, and of course we've all experienced that. Load shedding. If our economic growth exceeds the rate at which we produce electricity, we will be in serious trouble again. So the opportunity, if you think about it, to create Globeleq in Africa, another 10 or 20 Globeleq in Africa is there. The question is, do we have the political will to do it? $329 billion have been invested in clean energy and rising, an average increase of 15% per annum. And of course, we do run an index at EY globally. The top 40 renewable energy countries in the world, which we call the Renewable Energy Country Attractiveness Index. We've got 4 African countries: South Africa, Morocco, Kenya, and Egypt. At the moment, our renewable energy capacity is 3% of installed capacity in the Southern African power pool. 3%. Therefore, opportunities, there's another 50%, because we're hoping that by 2050, 2040, renewable energy will comprise about 50% of the produced electricity. Market attractiveness, new competitors, what attracts investors to a market? Because to me, this is the challenge which we face in Africa. There's a market drivers, there's energy market drivers, there's technology-specific drivers. Now all of these you've got to get in sync with one another. And I'm proud to say the political will then on the renewable energy program in South Africa gave the current Breitenbachs the capacity to do that. In summary, electricity demand is growing and is going to increase by 2/3 between now and 2040. What is critical is to have a cost-effective revenue stream to unlock investments in power. That will ensure supply that is acceptable, affordable, accessible, and accountable.
How would you go about this whole concept of thought and a framework program enabling sustainable capacity in infrastructure development? And you see, the interesting thing for me is, we heard the word fragmented used earlier on. You would imagine that to get people to work together is a really simple thing to do. You would imagine that to get universities to collaborate in research is a really easy thing to do. It turns out that we're very good at collaborating with European universities, American universities, universities in the Far East. But it's actually quite weird that sometimes you discover that you're not even collaborating with people next door to you. The point is, unless we start to do that, how are we actually going to really make a difference and compete? And I think that's part of the reason that Ian McKechnie's been involved to try and say, how do we build those bridges? The point is that this continent is vast. And because it's so incredibly vast, it means that whatever we do in terms of energy is going to be something which we haven't really done in the world before. We're going to have to look at this thing differently, try and reinvent the way we do things. It cannot be business as usual. Because the one thing we don't want is to see Africa effectively recolonized and not allowed to grow and develop itself. So the key thing is, how do we find a way of doing this by Africa, in Africa, and for Africa? And for me, that's the profoundly important question, and one that we are trying to tackle in terms of the kind of research that we're beginning to do. So if you're going to start building massive power stations, or for that matter, large photovoltaic arrays, you've got to be certain that at any point you're able to absorb that energy safely into the grid. And one of the interesting things that happened when we start looking at the way transmission lines operate is that at a quarter of a wavelength, you can open a circuit and have a perfect open circuit, but the supply will see it as a short circuit, which is quite interesting. And that means that you've got to design your grid in a very, very special way. The more you start adding length to your system, the more you start adding more countries into that grid, the more challenges you have in terms of how do you get those things to speak to each other. So for instance, if you've got a 50 Hertz system operating in South Africa, and now you start connecting that to a 50 Hertz system in Zimbabwe, you've got to make absolutely certain that these things are perfectly synchronized. If they're not synchronized, you get some very, very interesting effects, and it ends in a fire. Is that we're focusing very, very heavily on what happens if you use high voltage DC. Now the beautiful thing about high voltage DC is DC. There's no frequency in DC. What it means is you can take non-synchronized AC systems, convert that to DC, glue them together, get them to share energy. This is important. It allows you to transfer the energy from one place to the other. And then when you get to the load side, you can actually resynchronize that electronically with your grid. The point is that the advances in modern power electronics have really allowed us to get that right. This continent is a continent of absolute opportunity. But in order for anything here to work, we're going to have to find ways of collaborating, on breaking down that fragmentation and working together. And this is, I think, the key message that comes out of this. One of the most powerful ways of breaking down barriers is engaging with other academics. Because academics from universities tend to be somewhat agnostic about what country they're doing their research in. So I think that using the academic channel to break down those boundaries has immense potential. If you want to grow and develop your economy, you've got to be driving a research agenda, because that research agenda does something quite spectacular within the population. It isn't something that's nice to have. It's absolutely essential in any economy where you start to grow and develop that economy. You've got to create, the word thought leadership was used earlier on, you've got to create that thought leadership, and you've got to have, why not, leading scholars on the planet in this continent, because we need to take responsibility for driving this future together.
The 2/3 that isn't connected at all, in South Africa it's on the order of 15%. That's a whole different problem, because then they'll never have enough money to pay back the investment on $1.3 billion for whatever energy resource. So that requires new business models. It also requires innovation in technology as well as business model innovation. And I didn't really hear you talk on that.
Now, there certainly seems to be an acknowledgement sort of countrywide in Africa by government that there is a need for further development. But there also seems to be a pervasive reticence to go from knowing that there's a problem to doing something about it. So my question to you as a collective panel is, how, as a league of sort of extraordinary gentlemen, do you propose we get governments, not just in South Africa, but in Africa, to sit at the table and actually have to listen to what you have to say?
So there's no question, the concept of smart grid, putting intelligence into the network, effectively building virtual power stations by optimizing how you use your energy is absolutely fundamental to everything that we do. I mean, for example, if you now start thinking about solar power, which has one irritating characteristic, it only produces energy when the sun shines, okay, that's irritating. But what you can do is you can say, well, when the sun's shining in the Northern Cape, why don't we instruct every geezer in Johannesburg to start accepting that power on the assumption that we can wheel the power through to it? But that's the kind of smart stuff that you need to begin to do. One of the things that we probably need to do is recognize that energy is a resource. It's not something you just get and you pay for it. It's actually a resource, and it needs to be managed and it needs to be nurtured. And part of that means using it intelligently and controlling how you use it. And we have those technologies. We have the technologies to absolutely do that kind of thing.
In the African context, the smart grid scenario is gaining in prominence. In fact, next week, the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers has a big 3-day conference on smart grids at the ESCOM Academy. Safe to say that the programs got started because we had the political will, we had the capacity, and the money because there was a market. Now, the challenge with power in the wider scheme of things is that somebody's got to pay for it.
So my sense is that now that we have sobered out, we are also accepting of both dull and clever blacks and others. We will get somewhere.
Where is the money going to come from is a good question. I think for the utility scale projects, the challenge isn't where does the money come from. The challenge is actually projects that are well enough structured to attract the money.
Yeah.
So it's all about having projects that are structured properly. And one of the fundamental linchpins to a well-structured project is the sales agreement with the utility. And it really comes down to risk allocation and what parties are best situated to take which risks. And that's what project finance is. That's what underwrites our type of utility scale power projects that will mobilize private capital. The money's out there. The money would flow tomorrow to the right type of projects. It's just getting well-structured projects.
If we work under the assumption that we are going to continue at that rate of development in the battery technology and expecting improvements in efficiency of photovoltaic panels and that, is the utility model in itself under threat? In other words, should we not be giving each person their solar panel and their battery, and actually that central distribution maybe is not such a sustainable concept anymore?
We need to and this is the important point, very consciously and very responsibly make use of the resources that are available. If you want to keep using natural resources that are not renewable, you need to make a hard choice around that. We're going to have to do that. There's no doubt about that. So actually, we're still going to burn coal. We're going to do all sorts of strange things and transfer it all over the show. At the same time, there's no doubt technologies are changing. And there will come, without question, a moment when probably, unless it's a massive base load, you will be generating for your living unit. The energy that you use will be generated in that living unit. That is the way it's going to be. Oh, and by the way, you can then make it even smarter by saying, when I've got an excess, how do I share that with my neighbor, and so forth. There's no question that's what's going to come.
The whole issue of capacity building and capability building, and then the issue around the enabling frameworks are key. And those are the key success factors behind the South African renewable program's success, was that you have the right framework, and we build capacity and the right capacity to be able to bring those projects to fruition. And then just to pick up on the issue of the question about skills and renewable projects, especially small-scale renewable projects and mini-grid type projects, there's a big opportunity for skills development. In the past, we've always thought about the engineering skills pyramid, where you've got your engineers and your technologists and your technicians and your artisans. But there's this huge underlying layer of semi-skilled and informal where there's an opportunity through these types of projects to bring that potential labour force into the mainstream, upskill them, and then also provide them ways for them to articulate to higher levels of training. So those smaller scale projects provide huge opportunities going forward.
I believe ultimately sense and sensibility will prevail. There'll come a time when those who are obdurate and obstructive will come to realize that that does not quite pay. Even where your voting populace, I mean, all of us for a long, long time have been concerned with paying or enjoying what was then called the Liberation Dividend. Now that Liberation Dividend is dissipating. Talk to me about now and the future. And I know the voting populace will in fact there'll come a time when there's a demand for it. And the kind of leadership that does respond to that will come to the fore.